On today's World Insight with Tian, U.S. to withdraw troops from Syria. Who will fill the vacuum left by the Americans? And our exclusive interview with a senior Chinese military official. Anti-piracy in the Gulf of Aden and security-related issues China faces today. Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian. The program is coming to you live on CGTN from Beijing. The departing U.S. Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, has signed an executive order to withdraw American troops from Syria on Christmas Eve. According to U.S. media, the withdrawal is expected to start and also finish in a few weeks. What would it mean for all the parties involved in the war-torn country? Before we begin our discussion, take a look.
For the first time in 8 years, Syrians in Damascus will celebrate Christmas with peace. The question is, will it last? The day after Christmas, Syrian state media reported that Syrian air defense units have intercepted several missiles targeting the capital city. And they were fired by Israeli warplanes. While Israel has been targeting Iranian-backed forces in Syria, Israeli military officials have yet to comment on their reports. The incident came after the U.S. suddenly announced the end of its military activity in Syria last week, citing victory over ISIL as the reason.
And we have won against ISIS. We've beaten them and we've beaten
the U.S. entered Syria in 2014 without the consent of the Syrian government. The imminent departure of around 2,000 American troops has been welcomed by three key stakeholders on the ground: Iran, Turkey, and Russia. But the news was not applauded by American allies, especially the Kurds. Kurdish forces have enjoyed autonomy in some parts of northeastern Syria. They joined hands with American soldiers in fighting ISIL in Syria, but now they are left alone to face Turkey, who regards them as terrorist groups. While the U.S.'s European allies agree ISIL has been weaker than ever, France says their troops are staying in Syria to counter remaining ISIL forces. Germany, Britain, and Iraq also voiced their discontent over the decision. In a rare case of domestic unity, American politicians across the aisle criticized the decision to withdraw.
I can promise you that everything that happened in Iraq is going to happen in Syria unless we change course.
Trump's Defense Secretary James Mattis said his views are not aligned with the president's and resigned amid the announcements of the U.S. pulling out of Syria and downsizing its presence in Afghanistan. The U.S. envoy for the global coalition to defeat the Islamic State also resigned in a sign of objection. Tangled up by international powers, stability would be good news for Syrians at home and those abroad as refugees.
For more discussion on the U.S. withdrawal from Syria, we have in Boston Jim Walsh from the Security Studies Program from MIT. In Washington, D.C., Bülent Ali Reza, Director and Senior Associate of the Turkey Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Last but not least, in Moscow, Dmitry Barbish, political analyst from Sputnik International News Agency. Want to welcome the three of you, gentlemen, for being with us during this holiday season. Thank you so much. Want to start with you, Mr. Walsh. First of all, in the United States, already huge debate. One is about the White House, the authorities that the White House could have, and the other is about the oversight of the Congress in this regard. Mr. Walsh, where is the fight going? Likely to be resolved?
Well, I think Congress essentially booted away any attempted oversight with respect to Syria. It had years and years and years to pass an authorization for military force. Remember, in the U.S. Constitution, in Article 1, it's Congress that has the power to declare war, but Congress is always so scared of taking responsibility, it never gets around to doing it. And so it never provided authorization for the U.S. to go into Syria in the first place, but now it's crying and complaining that Trump is withdrawing. I think the withdrawal will happen. I actually think it's a good idea. I never liked the idea that the U.S. had troops in Syria to begin with. I think strategically it makes no sense. And so I think the Pentagon will withdraw that, and there's nothing Congress can do about it.
Mr. Wash, if briefly, when you say it doesn't make any sense, what do you exactly mean?
Well, we have 2,000 troops in Syria. What are you going to do with 2,000 troops? I mean, when we went into, when the U.S. returned to Iraq, it was because the government of Iraq invited U.S. troops back in when ISIS attacked them. Syria did not invite the U.S. into Syria. Moreover, that war essentially, unfortunately, is all but done. It seems to me that the Russians, the Syrians, and the Iranians have taken control, and they have as much interest in killing ISIS as the Americans do. And I think they're going to kill quite a number of them. So it didn't seem like a very good reason for the U.S. to stay in a country that it's not wanted, although clearly the Kurds are the ones who are facing the consequences to this withdrawal.
Since you're mentioning about the Russians, let's also have Mr. Barbish to join us. From your perspective, the U.S. is leaving, and according to President Trump, as fast as possible. So what would that mean for Russians, especially the Russian troops and Russia's allies in the country?
Well, let me remind you that Russia only has military police in Syria. We don't have the army. So obviously we cannot replace anyone, any occupying force from outside. You know, the Russian military police is only used to kind of separate the warring parties in the so-called zones of deconfliction zones, de-escalation zones. Also, Russia has Air Force, which was used against not only ISIS, but also other terrorist Islamist organizations. But obviously, Air Force is not something that allows you to control territory. However, what is important, I agree with Jim Walsh that it would be a good development if the American troops left. For a very simple reason, they are there illegally. According to international law, there are only two options why foreign troops can be on a sovereign state's territory. Either they are invited by the government, for example, the government is fighting some dangerous terrorists, or they can be authorized to go there by the United Nations. Neither is the case with the American troops east of Euphrates. Also, the American troops east of Euphrates became a danger because the Turkish President Erdogan announced his decision to move in there in order to prevent the creation of what he called terrorist statelet. You know, he obviously meant the Kurds, which are also a substantial minority in Turkey. So obviously it would be a terrible development if the U.S. troops got into a fight with the Turks east of Euphrates, and it would be a terrible blow to the solidarity of NATO, which is already compromised by many unwise moves, not so much by the United States as by the European Union. It was the European Union that moved first against Libya under President Sarkozy of France, and in other countries also.
All right. Dr. Ali Reza, you've been attentively listening to your two colleagues. Your insight about this, of course, any decision made by Washington today will be applauded by some, well, also despised by the others. That's only natural, particularly these days. Dr. Ali Reza, in the longer term, is ISIS a problem? Is the division of the powers that are interacting with Syria the problem? Is specific countries like Turkey and some of the others the issue here, or Israel? Dr. Ali Reza, your insight.
Well, clearly ISIS was a problem. After all, they had the seat of the caliphate in Syria. It began the Islamic radicalism of the kind that ISIS represented, began in Iraq and then expanded into Syria. The capital was in Raqqa, but their most important position was Mosul. They lost Mosul, then they lost Raqqa. And let me remind everybody who's watching that it was primarily the Syrian Kurds, the YPG, together with the Americans that took Raqqa. It wasn't the Russians, it wasn't the Iranians, and certainly it wasn't the Syrian government, and it wasn't the Turks. Now, there are some remnants of ISIS deep in the southeast part of Syria, right along the Iraqi border. The Kurds were in the process of finishing them off, albeit in the context of the Syrian Democratic Forces aligned with the U.S. And one of the reasons that Mattis and McGurk, the special envoy,
right.
Resigned, it was because they, together with almost the entire security establishment, including National Security Advisor Bolton, did not agree with the decision. And it was, you say that it was a decision of the United States, but it was the decision of the Commander-in-Chief, contrary to the advice that he was getting from within his administration, leave aside Congress, that wanted the fight to continue, also
right.
to counter Iranian influence within Syria. Now, obviously, the president has the authority to do this. Mattis had to resign, but still signed the order for withdrawal, as you said. The U.S. will withdraw, and let's see who will fill the gap in Syria, and specifically, who will continue the fight against ISIS that I fear will continue even after this decision.
Dr. Ali Reza, since you asked the question, who and who, then what's your answer to the who and who question? Very briefly, sir.
Well, apparently that conversation on December 14th between Turkish President Erdogan and Trump, which all now agree was a key factor in Trump's sudden decision, and I fear it wasn't a thought-through decision to withdraw. Apparently Erdogan promised to finish off ISIS. Now, if you look at the map of Syria, you know, Turkish forces, which are in control of 2 pockets of Syria in the north, again without the invitation of the Syrian government, even if they move into the area east of the Euphrates, it's a long, long way from there down to the southeastern corner of Syria, where ISIS is still positioned. And it's very unlikely that Turkey could or would do the job.
Right.
You know, with the Syrian government having never focused on ISIS, will they now focus on ISIS? I doubt it very much. And the Russians, contrary to you know, to previous claims, the Russians have never seriously fought ISIS in the past. They had other priorities in Syria.
All right.
So I fear that ISIS will once again
absolutely wrong. I have to say here a few words.
Will get stronger again.
Yes.
All right, Mr. Barbish, of course, you will have your words.
Okay. Well, let me remind you how Russians came to Syria in the first place. In the end of 2013, ISIS declared itself as a force operating in Syria and in Iraq. At that time, there were no Russian planes, no Russian troops in Syria. The Russian planes arrived in September 2015. Between the end of 2013 and 2015, if you look at the map, ISIS was only expanding. It was not contracting. The Americans were already there. The so-called coalition led by the United States bombed ISIS during all of these more than 12 months between the between the announcement of ISIS existence and the coming of Russians. And somehow the so-called Islamic State just kept expanding. As Bülent rightly said, they took Mosul. They were expanding on the Syrian territory. So it was only after Russia came and the joint operation between the Syrian army and the Russian aviation started that ISIS started to contract. And in the end, it just occupies just a small parcel of land on the Iraqi border. So, however, I think that when we say that Turkey or the United States or someone else should fight the Islamic State, the so-called Islamic State on the Syrian territory, this is simply legally absurd. Syria is a sovereign country. In a sovereign country, this is the government that fights terrorists. The government and other foreign forces that this government chooses to invite.
I see.
The Syrian government did not invite Erdogan. It did not invite the United States. It did not invite the Saudis. It did not invite the Israelis. So the actions of all of these troops on their territory is simply illegal.
Okay.
And I would say morally condemnable.
All right. Mr. Walsh, is it a sovereignty issue?
Well, I'd love to hear my Russian colleagues say all this, and I'm sure people in Georgia and in Ukraine will be thrilled to hear that Russia doesn't believe intervening in places where it's uninvited. I expect that all those Russian green men will be leaving Ukraine now.
Well,
and they'll be leaving Georgia. They'll be leaving
ladies
Crimea.
And gentlemen, let's focus
but I agree with
Syria.
Yes, well, I'm just saying there's a little hypocrisy here. But I actually agree with the principle. Syria is a sovereign country. The U.S. was not invited in. I don't think there's going to be a lot of difference. I don't see why it will be hard for the Russians and the Syrians to shift from killing Syrian Free Army to killing ISIS. I mean, if Assad wants control of his country back, and basically they are far down that path, unfortunately, I think Assad is a war criminal and he should be in a prison cell in The Hague, but facts are facts. And facts are that Assad and his allies have taken control of most of Syria, and they are going to want to finish the job. They're not going to want to let ISIS have a safe haven in Syria. So I don't know why it's so hard for the Russians or the Syrians to simply retarget their efforts.
Obviously, our audience could already read, not even between the lines, but really simply what the arguments are from all sides. Having said that, though, some bigger questions about the region. As we all know, the Middle East is experiencing dramatic transformation right now, and particularly about the U.S. role in the region, U.S. withdrawal attitude, quote-unquote, and also some of the other hotspots that are competing with the Middle East. Dr. Ali Reza, very briefly, if I beg you and your colleagues, help us to understand how will this eventually have an impact on the overall map that we are looking at right now in the Middle East, particularly given the thought that Israel is going to have an earlier election this year before the middle of the year. And the Prime Minister wants to sit in the office for the longest term ever. So, Dr. Ali Reza, all of these are factors that are zooming in on this region. Dr. Ali Reza.
Well, thank you for broadening the discussion to the regional issues, because I think it's important to touch on them. Now, Israel's main preoccupation in Syria was to counter growing Iranian influence. Given the fact that Israel considers the Iranian nuclear threat to be the preeminent threat to itself, and its willingness to actually act against Iran, to bomb Iranian targets, Iranian deployments in Syria, shows what its strategic priority is. Now, prior to the decision by President Trump, John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, having visited Israel, had begun to formulate a new policy to justify the presence of U.S. troops in Syria to counter the Iranian threat. Now, there's a huge question mark over this, and as Israel proceeds to elections, I think that this is very much going to be part of the debate, in addition to Gaza, the threat from Gaza, from Hamas, the threat from Hezbollah in Lebanon. There's also the question of the possible threat of the Iranian presence in Syria that's going to be discussed. Now, the U.S., having made this move, now has to decide whether confronting Iran in Syria is going to be part of the growing confrontation that President Trump has declared the U.S. to be on against Iran, including ending the JCPOA agreement and confronting Iran and its proxies in Yemen and elsewhere. We're going to have to see. And then you put in the question of where the Russians fit into this.
Well, we're going to have to see, because the other speakers also have their own insights. And Mr. Walsh, you have 45 seconds, I'm afraid, to bring us your thoughts.
Well, I think obviously with Netanyahu facing challenges at home, still more corruption charges and an early election, some people will worry that he will intervene in Iran and maybe bomb those Iranian nuclear facilities as a way to bolster his domestic position at home. That would be a terrible outcome, I think. As for Iranian meddling, I mean, I hear this as a justification all the time. You'll remember that when the U.S. went into Syria, its only mission was to defeat ISIS, and then it got expanded to stopping Iran, and then it got expanded to let's get Assad out of power. I think that was a mistake. Iran and Syria have been allies for a long time. That's not changing. That's not going away.
Okay.
And 2,000 troops on the ground in Syria was not going to alter that outcome.
Thank you, sir. And last but not least, 30 seconds left, Mr. Barbish, for your thoughts. Just to be fair, everybody has a say.
Well, I think that the decision of Mr. Trump was not unexpected because 2 days before that, the president of Tunisia invited President Assad of Syria for the first time to the summit of the Arab League. So Assad was kind of legitimized by this decision, also by the statement from the Turkish foreign minister. So the question now is, will the U.S. troops leave Syria on Trump's orders? I'm not sure, because the United States is not ruled by the elected president. It's ruled by the terrible ultra-liberal ideology, which operates via media and via some people in the Congress.
A lot of accusations, but certainly a lot of insights as well from the conversation. Thank you so much, the three of you, for joining us. Jim Walsh, Bülent Ali Reza, last but not least, Dmitry Barbish. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us during this holiday season. Really appreciate it. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program, our exclusive with a senior Chinese military official, Senior Colonel Zhou Bo, on anti-piracy in the Gulf of Aden and security-related issues China faces today.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
The world is changing fast, taking all our lives with it. But we can change it too, by seeking answers to problems through discussions and debates. On World Insight, I ask direct questions to real people in the know, seek genuine answers, but respect diverse perspectives. Our live global debates tackle the most critical issues head-on. World Insight with Tian Wei go beyond the headlines.
You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live Monday to Friday on CGTN. This Wednesday marks the 10th anniversary of the Chinese Navy's anti-piracy effort in the Gulf of Aden and the waters of Somalia. Through the Navy's rescue and humanitarian missions and, of course, the anti-piracy efforts, China has gained more trust from other countries and demonstrated the sense of responsibility of a global player. Take a look.
Pirates take aim at a Chinese ship in the Gulf of Aden.
They've attacked over 100 ships this year and successfully hijacked more than 40 of the vessels.
In a rare press appearance, Navy officials announced China will send 3 warships to fight piracy in waters off the Somali coast. It's the first time in modern history that China has sent warships so far for anything other than peacekeeping or goodwill.
10 years later, on December 9th, 2018, the 31st Fleet from the Chinese Navy disembarked from South China's Guangdong province. Over the past decade, the Chinese Navy has deployed 26,000 officers and soldiers, escorted 6,595 ships, and successfully rescued or aided more than 60 Chinese and foreign ships. In April 2017, the 25th Fleet successfully rescued 19 sailors on a Tuvaluan cargo ship from pirates. Apart from the escort missions, the Navy also carried out various other missions, including the evacuation of Chinese nationals from the war zones in Libya in 2011 and Yemen in 2015. It also escorted chemical weapons out of Syria in 2013 and helped search for the missing flight MH370. Over the past 10 years, the Chinese Navy has fulfilled its commitment and made great contributions to maintaining world peace and stability.
For more with us in our Beijing studio, we have Senior Colonel Zhou Bo, who is a director from the Security Cooperation Center with the International Military Cooperation Office from the Ministry of National Defense. What a pleasure to have you, sir.
Thank you.
Senior Colonel Zhou. China's work with the other militaries in the Gulf of Aden to curb piracy, how will that help to build confidence and trust? And will that be able to help whether militaries among one another and also even countries be able to get across this very difficult period?
Well, counter-piracy in the Gulf of Aden is certainly a joint effort of the international navies, and is a brilliant example of how international cooperation is needed to address the threats around the world. Because ever since the end of 2008, when China sent its first a task force to the Gulf of Aden, so far we have sent 31 task forces, which has escorted 6,600 ships. Half of them are foreign ships. And Chinese Navy actually is cooperating with more than 20 other navies in the Gulf of Aden. And this is definitely significant for the Chinese Navy in that before this, the Chinese Navy actually isn't very much involved in wars, unlike PLA Army, unlike PLA Air Force. But this is the first time that the PLA Navy is becoming the so-called blue water Navy. And for you to operate so far away from Chinese coast, you need international cooperation with like-minded partners.
Talking about international cooperation, to what extent is the cooperation really taking place on a day-to-day basis?
First of all the international navies share information on a platform called Mercury, which is designed and made by European Union. It is coded. So each party would provide information, and each party could coordinate its own military operation with other parties. And at the tactical levels, China is one of the independent deployers. That means it's not a part of the coalition, like NATO, like EU, or like combined maritime forces headed by the United States. In spite of the fact that China is an independent deployer, like Russia, like India, it is still coordinating very well with all other international navies, although they are operating in different waters.
What kind of information sharing are taking place on a daily basis? How are the other countries are benefiting, and how is China benefiting from this process?
Well, China definitely has benefited hugely from information sharing, because in terms of PLA's capabilities, some things are still need to be improved. For example, your projection capabilities. For you to project your militaries away from your territory, you need big, heavy airlifting cargo planes. And information is another issue, because how can you get your information? You either get information through your people, or through satellite, or through other means. But still, this is something we need to share with other people. Because, for example, in the Gulf of Aden, if you look at a small ship, how could you conclude it is a fishing boat or is it a pirate ship? Because I was actually shown when I was attending the conference in Bahrain for international military cooperation, the chief of staff of EU just pointed at a picture, say, you see so many ships are there. Which one is a pirate ship? Which one is a fishing ship?
It's very confusing.
Yeah, and which one is a fishing ship today and a pirate ship tomorrow? So for this, we need to identify, and it needs a lot of information. And if you have information, we could share it on the Mercury.
Well, the United States, as you may know, Senior Colonel Zhou, has been talking about the Indo-Pacific. That's the key phrase they have been using many times. But many wonder what is going to be China's potential goal in the Indian Ocean. And of course, that correlates in a way with China's development of the peacekeeping missions, which is including with the counter-piracy issue.
Well, the Indian Ocean is certainly most important. Apart from counter-piracy, there is about 1 million Chinese workers working in the rimland of the Indian Ocean, and we definitely have a good relationship with all the littoral states and even with India itself. So therefore, China has a huge stake in maintaining peace and stability in the Indian Ocean. The Chinese Navy has built up a logistics supply station in Djibouti. That is the first logistics supply station in the Indian Ocean. And that shows our effort to strengthen our legitimate presence there, not only for us, but also for the well-being of other countries in the region.
China, unlike some of the other countries which have been building military bases all over the world, have been very neutral in that regard. What's going to be China's military's goal for the near future, since you already got Djibouti as a logistic supply station?
Well, it depends on the change of situations, because I could argue the other way around. But for counter-piracy in the Gulf of Aden, probably the Chinese military would have never come to consider to establish a logistics supply station in Djibouti. And with the expansion of China's interest, definitely you have to think about the other options. But I need to point out about the so-called string of pearls series, which was coined by Mr. Hamilton probably 15 years ago. He describes that China, for China to project its military influence, China got to establish a litany of military bases in the Indian Ocean. But after more than a decade, so where are these litany? Where is this litany of bases? So now I even read some opinions written by Westerners arguing that this actually is a fallacy. It's not written by Chinese. It is written by Westerners, because after 15 years, whether you have a base or not is clear to everybody.
China's military power has always been a key interest to the international community. China is now the second largest contributor to UN's peacekeeping expenses. China also provides the largest number of peacekeeping troops among all the permanent UN Security Council members. In the contested South China Sea, fears of a China-US clash reached a high point when ships from both sides nearly collided in October, but the crisis was averted. And later this year, the top defense officials from both countries met in person to discuss cooperation. As China gains more experience in security, it grows into a global player. China is increasingly mediating between countries and maintaining stability on the global stage. Senior Colonel Zhou, what about China's missions in the South China Sea? China's future goals and the blueprint of protect itself, while at the same time not to project too much pressure to the others.
The South China Sea is becoming an issue, but not for good reasons. The point is that China did land reclamation there, but first of all, it's on the isles and islets and rocks that we have under our control, and we are not the first one to do it. And the interesting thing is, the United States claims that it would not take sides, and it has no position on this issue. But the current situation is China and the ASEAN countries actually are negotiating code of conduct on the South China Sea. And as our Premier Li Keqiang mentioned that we will just speed up this process. So being said, the whole atmosphere is improving. Therefore, it's our sincere wish that leave this to China and other claimants. Let us solve this problem, because this process is already going on. There shouldn't be the interference from outsiders.
But Senior Colonel Zhou, we are all well aware of the incident not long ago in which the Chinese and the American ships, military ones, are just passing one another 40 meters in between. It could be eventually a huge incident, and as a result of an accident. Of course, it didn't happen, God bless us, but still, there's a lot of potential danger over there.
Yes, both China and the United States are fully aware of such danger, and that is what I said in the beginning, that both sides are committed to make efforts to prevent this from happening. In fact, between China and the U.S. military, there are a number of crisis management measures already in place. The question is how to read them correctly, and more importantly, how do you practice to make sure that what you are doing is actually in accordance with what has been written.
So, how do you read them?
Oh, yes. The question is, these American ships came into the 12 nautical miles of the waters of Chinese islands. It's not that we are within the 12 nautical mile waters of the continental USA. So the fundamental problem, as I would see it, is that the U.S. Is sending ships to provoke you, and they do not hide that. They mean they just want to challenge your excessive claims. This is what they say. But the point is, China has its own understanding of the international law, and China is not standing alone. Probably there are about 27 countries who more or less have similar ideas about sovereignty issue or about rules and regulation regarding the regulations in that area of water. For example, India. India's regulation actually is much more harsh than China's, because when India submit its agreement to UNCLOS in 1995, it has made it clear that it would not accept any arbitration under Article 298, and should any foreign countries conduct military exercises in this exclusive economic zone, if it involves ammunition or explosive, it has to ask for consent of the Indian government.
Right. China's Belt and Road Initiative, for example, recently have run into some what called as unfair speculations. People wonder, at least some, about the ultimate goal of the OBOR or BRI, and wonder whether China is having its own hegemony.
On the Belt and Road Initiative, there are certain misunderstandings about this project itself. But as I have written and published in Financial Times, I argue that first of all, it's not a trap, because China has to spend a lot of money to make such a trap. Second, it's not a charity, because China would also want to have it becoming mutually beneficial. And China is still a country where there are still people who live on the poverty line. So such great Herculean efforts from the Chinese government and Chinese people are at least laudable and justifiable. In terms of security, this kind of project is not directly security related, because it's about economy first.
That's right.
But of course it has a security implication in that if this project is well built and it serves the people along the Belt and Road, of course it will make people's life better, and that will bring peace and stability.
And therefore, what would that mean for the military operations, for example, and also the peacekeeping missions of China, if others are having increasing, apparently, doubts about China's goal?
We have talked enough about counter-piracy. Probably peacekeeping is more appropriate for your current topics. I'm thinking about the one end of the Belt and Road, that is in Africa. And actually, most of our peacekeepers are working in Africa. Apart from Lebanon, all the 4 countries are in Africa. So we currently have 2,506 peacekeepers working in 5 countries and in UN headquarters. Most of them are working in Africa. And this is a great contribution of the Chinese military, because compared with all other permanent members of the Security Council, China definitely is the biggest. And in terms of the whole number, China now ranks 11th. But China's efforts are stepping up. And it is irreversible, because as President Xi announced in 2015, President Xi actually has announced a litany of very quantifiable pledges, including setting up 8,000 standby troops. And what does that mean? If the 8,000 standby troops plus 2,500 soldiers, that is more than 10,000 people, which is almost as big as many armed forces in African countries. And that shows our commitment.
Senior Colonel Zhou, before we go, with now China and the United States, 2 of the world's largest economies and certainly 2 of the very influential players on the international stage, seem to be in intense debates about what the future lies for the bilateral relations, and the increasing discussions about the international mechanism, whether it's about the UN or some of the others. So what will be China's goal eventually when it comes to peacekeeping, including counter-piracy, when it comes to building its military, and also when it comes to its interactions with the other militaries in the world?
Well, I have taken notice that 2 American documents released by Pentagon and the remarks by American Vice President Pence describe China as a strategic competitor overtaking Russia. But probably there is always a need for optimism. And the optimism is that they still have yet to describe China as enemy. And they haven't described this relationship as a hostile. So there is room for our continuous cooperation wherever possible and whenever necessary. And I believe it is possible and necessary, because even today, China and the US military are still having joint drill on humanitarian aid and disaster relief. And President Trump and President Xi once pledged together to make joint efforts to help the capacity building of African countries in peacekeeping. So it is these small little things that look like the light at the end of the tunnel. So if we have confidence, we can walk through the dark tunnel and see the light.
With that shining note, in a way, thank you so much, Senior Colonel Zhou Bo, for being with us. Really appreciate it, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN to your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.